Bueno, Mauri, adelante.
Ok, pues gracias a todos por estar aquí para esta primera charla. Es mi placer presentar a la profesora Ángela Betancourt-Ciprian de la Universidad de Illinois en Chicago, que nos va a hablar sobre su proyecto de Cubanidad en Chicago y el español allá. Adelante.
Hey, muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchísimas gracias por recibirme acá. Les había informado a Martín y a Brisa que probablemente voy a estar haciendo bastante cambio de código a lo largo de la charla. Cualquier problema me avisan en el chat. Es que simplemente se me sale más fácil así. Pero sí, estoy súper emocionada para presentarles hoy lo que viene siendo la material de mi tesis, que apenas defendí en el verano de 2022. Así que esto es bastante reciente, pero todavía sigue en trabajo. Déjame ver cómo comparto acá. Ok,
Perfecto, lo podemos ver.
perfecto. Ok, pues sí, como Marty les mencionó, hoy voy a estar presentando acerca de las identidades y las ideologías lingüísticas de los cubanos que viven aquí en Chicago. So we're going to talk both about both things, right? Identity and ideology. Uh, as Marty said, I am located in the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm also an alumni, so this is my home university for a very long time. So I work in the department as a Hispanic linguistics professor. I also direct the Spanish as a Heritage Language program. And yeah, this is my data from my thesis, so let's get into it. All right. There's a ton of backstory that can be given about Cubans and their history in the United States, but we're going to focus on a really quick breakdown to put everybody on the same page of why I looked at what I decided to look at with these speakers. So, research typically breaks down Cuban immigration into 4 waves. Now, this is very argumented. There's a lot of researchers that say that it's much more nuanced than this and that it needs to be expanded upon. However, these waves are very real for those who have immigrated, right? So they very much identify with one or the other. And it kind of gives us an idea of their leaning politically, their leaning linguistically, and things like that. So the first wave was documented to have begun in 1959. So this is immediately after Fidel Castro comes to power, and there's a quick flight of people that are not in agreement with these politics, people that have a lot to lose financially and things like that. And because of which, the socioeconomic status of this first wave is majority professional or managerial. It's also an overrepresentation of white Cubans. And what I mean when I say overrepresentation is this is not what the racial breakdown looked like on the island in Cuba at that time, but those that had this socioeconomic status to leave at that time were overwhelmingly white presenting Cubans with these European roots. They received a large amount of aid from the US government at that time that very much wanted to align with anything that was perceived as saving people from communism and giving them a chance to leave communist states. And so they received a lot of aid through a program called the Cuban Refugee Program. So they received a lot of support when they arrived. They were put with host families. They got these monthly stipends to kind of get them on their feet and get them running here in the United States. Overall, their perception in the United States was overwhelmingly positive. Like I said, this was a time during this Red Scare where any state or country that was perceived to be leaning communist was very much, received here in the United States as a welcome asylum to help them combat this, right? So then we've got wave 2 that is identified from 1965 to 1973. Now we see a bit more of a shift towards working class, okay? And this is because it was a different organization, right? So it didn't necessarily need the means. These were some organized flights. These were what were called the freedom flights, okay? And so you didn't need as much means as you did in the first wave. So we start seeing a bit of a shift in terms of socioeconomic status, but we still do see an overrepresentation of white Cubans. Most who left needed to have some sort of relationship in the United States, right? So they needed somebody that was already established. That means that they were working on this already established network that was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly professional, and managerial. Once again, the Cuban refugee program was still in effect. So perception was still very positive. Now, with wave 3, which is documented to have started in 1980, we see a dramatic shift, okay? And this is for several reasons. One is the means to leave. So this was what was known as the wave of los Marielitos. And this was when Castro announced that anybody who would like to leave the island could do so through the port of Mariel, and that somebody simply would need to arrive with some sort of boat, some sort of method to take these Cubans back to the United States. So they didn't need an established network. They didn't need anything like that. They just needed to get themselves to the Puerto de Mariel. And because of this, we start seeing more of a representation of what the Cuban people actually look like in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of racial diversity. Okay, so now is where we see this important shift in terms of working towards working class, less than high school education, and overwhelmingly a higher percentage of Afro-Cubans than was present in the first 2 waves. Now, for those reasons, in addition to the perceived politics, right? So the people that stayed around until 1980, many thought, well, they must have been complicit in some form with this communist regime that came to power from 1959, right? Why did it take so long for them to leave was like the common perception. So because of those assumed politics, and because of this shift in socioeconomic status and racial diversity, we see a shift in the perception of these immigrants, right? It also didn't help that Fidel Castro did publicly announce that he was opening the doors of his jail cells, right, and letting out whoever wanted to leave, right? So he did this very purposeful propaganda to kind of manipulate the perception of these immigrants when they arrived to the United States. So there was this perceived perception of criminality in addition to all of these shifting factors. So overwhelmingly, we shift from this positive perception that the 2 first waves had to a negative perception. And then wave 4 is considered to be 1990s and on, and this is what we tend to refer as los balseros, right? And so we have this image here, this classic image of a balsero. So we're not talking about a well-established crafted boat. This is when we start seeing Cubans kind of put whatever's going to float into the water and really risk their lives to see if they can get to the United States. So this is once again overwhelmingly working class. We see a higher percentage of Afro-Cubans. They do not receive the same amount of aid that once was received for those first 2 waves, and the perception is still pretty negative publicly of these immigrants. So this shift is important that we see from here from wave 1 and 2 to wave 3. So what do we know about Miami Cubans in general, which is where the majority of Miami Cubans are established in the United States, right? Well, originally the literature focused on what they called the enclave effect and the exile ideology. And this tends to paint a really monolithic image of the Cubans living in Miami. And so the idea is that they live in this really isolated enclave where they can kind of have a sounding board with other Cubans, and their beliefs then intensify, right? That's the idea. And the beliefs that intensify, well, they're the tenets of this exile ideology. So these authors argued for these tenets of the exile ideology, which are Republican partisanship, support for the U.S. embargo, support for restricting travel to Cuba, and overall opposition towards diplomatic relations with Cuba. Those tend to be the overwhelming factors that were studied as defining these Miami Cubans for quite a while, right? We see the most recent publication, 2008. Well, recent work started to underscore that there's much more nuance to Miami Cubans than this, and this is a very limiting monolithic representation. And more recent publications do represent a shift and moving out beyond this representation, right? So overwhelmingly, there is a need for research that goes beyond this limited interpretation of Miami Cubans and Cubans in general living in the ethnic enclave. So my work aims to start to expand this view of Cubans moving outside of Miami and saying, okay, well, what does it look like when we look at them outside of Miami? Because majority of what is documented is done in Miami, Florida. So what are the varieties that are present in the literature that we have about Miami Cubans? Well, in 2015, Lynch and Carter documented that Miami-Dade had shifted to become the most dialectally diverse Spanish-speaking metropolitan area in the world. And so we see a breakdown here. This has shifted a bit since then, but we still see an overwhelming majority of Cubans. So 34.3% of the Spanish-speaking population is originally from Cuba or second generation Cuban, even third generation Cuban. And then the next largest group after that is Colombia, with a notably much smaller population, right? Drops all the way to 4.6. Then we've got Nicaragüenses, Boricuas, Dominicanos, but once again, in much smaller portions, right? So we see a big domination of Cubans here in Miami, which means that their Spanish really holds the standard, right? And I'm saying standard with quotes because I don't believe in that term, but we know that it has real world effects, okay? So Miami's really dictate kind of what is the standard of Spanish in Miami. So there's been documentation of this prestige that Cuban Spanish holds. Specifically, we can point to research done by Alfaraz and Fernandez Barrera, and they have done different dialectal perception tasks where they ask people to rate different varieties of Spanish, and the results of these have overwhelmingly shown prestige for not just Cuban Spanish, but what they refer to as the diaspora version of Cuban Spanish. That means Cubans who arrived in those first two waves, right? They are perceived to be like the OG Cubans that dominate what it means to and sound to be and sound Cuban, okay? So that is why in this graph that you see on the right hand, there is a distinction between two waves of Cuban Spanish, right? So what resulted in this prestige? Well, previous work started to point to, well, potentially there's been an increase in these stigmatized variants, such as lateralization of final R, since these first two waves, right? So they're trying to argue that over time, Spanish has shifted. We know that languages evolve, right? And they're saying that, well, we've got some documentation from 1980s and 1986 that things started to shift in terms of an increase in lateralization of final R. Okay, so other researchers decided to try and look to prove this and see, is this really what's going on that results in such a higher level prestige for these first two wave Cubans? And Alfaraz in 2018 did a matched guise study. Those that aren't familiar with matched guise, this means that you have two different types of audio samples, some with the prestigious realizations of phonological variants, meaning the realization as R, and then the stigmatized realization of that variant, meaning the lateralized realization of that variant. And then they attach labels to them, right? So they would put, Cuban that arrived in before 1975, right? Or Cuban that arrived in the 90s. And they would mix and match. So that means that you would get standardized realizations, but with a label of arrived in the 1990s, and stigmatized audios that actually said arrived before 1975, and vice versa, right? So some aligned with this perception of stigmatized versus prestigious, and some did not. And the idea is that providing this mismatch, we're going to see what really truly holds. Is it the audio that is resulting in the ranking, or is it the information that we have about the speaker? Well, the results of the study showed that it was overwhelmingly the information that they were given about the speaker and not the audio that they were hearing that resulted in their ranking and their rating of how correct the audio sounds. So this means, regardless of what they heard, if the information attached to that audio sample said arrived in the 1990s, they were overwhelmingly rating it as worse and less correct, regardless of what they heard, okay? So that means that this work that shows that potentially its increase of lateralized final R doesn't really hold. There's something else going on here that's resulting in these lower ratings. So Alfaraz realized her first study in 2002 and replicated it in 2014 and got pretty much the same result, where she saw an overwhelming assigning of prestige to this diaspora variety, meaning the Spanish represented of those living in Miami, established in Miami, overwhelmingly which in the 60s and 70s, okay? And so on a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being the least correct and 7 being the most correct, this variety of Spanish was perceived as the most correct right after Spain. specifically 6.38 out of 7, a really, really high rating. Whereas this other variety of Cuban Spanish, which they labeled Cuba Island, meaning those living there right now, and the Spanish of those reflected in those who are recently arriving and showing us what that island Spanish sounds like, received the lowest rating out of every other variety that was listed, with 3.56 out of 7. So this further confirms this prestige for the Spanish of those first two waves and the stigmatization of the Spanish of these perceived recent arrivals. Further research bears out that this is correlated with a negative perception of the Afro-Latinidad of these more recent waves. So we see that in the fact that the top 3 stigmatized varieties are not just Cuba Island, but also Puerto Rico and República Dominicana, which we all know are the 3 regions that are overwhelmingly Afro-Latino compared to the rest of Latin America, right? In addition, there was an open-ended part of this study where she asked people to offer justification for their rankings. And they were quite honest about their racial motivations. Specifically, speakers cited things like hablan anegrado when they referred to these recent Cuban arrivals. So they are aware that their stigma is directly correlated to the racial perception of these speakers, okay? So this is where we started to see a shift in the literature that, okay, something's going on here that is not linguistically motivated and has more to do with the body of the speaker. So what do we do with Cubans in Chicago? There is no documentation up to this point in terms of linguistic ideology and things like that. This is the limited information that I had to work with when I started my thesis. So the community began around the 1950s, which notably is before Fidel Castro came to power. And it was a shift that was motivated by a demand for labor. So before then, there was a demand for labor happening on the island, and there was a vacuum here in the United States, and it started motivating a bit of immigration. Well, by 1974, which is towards the end, towards the middle of that second wave, the Cuban refugee program that was working as this governmental aid that I mentioned previously had resettled about 7.5% of the first 2 waves of Cubans, specifically in Illinois. So there was a substantial amount of Cubans living here in the metropolitan area. Early research done in the 70s cited a high level of Spanish maintenance, but there's been no work about Spanish maintenance or loss since. And then in the 90s, we saw a shift in terms of migration where Chicago was identified as one of the 10 largest migration streams into the Miami Cuban area. So that means that people were leaving pretty quickly to Miami, and the population here in the metropolitan area was shrinking. Today, most recently, Cubans represent only 2.9% of local Latinos, so we're looking at about a little over 20,000. So it's been a big shift over time, right? In the 70s, we saw a much bigger group. Right now, it is quite smaller. So what are the questions that guided my research? So these were twofold, right? So mainly, I wanted to know about Chicago Cubans and how they index their identity. How could they be similar and different to the established research that has been done in Miami, Union City, New Jersey, Austin, and Albuquerque? And what does this reveal about the overall nuance of the Cuban American community, right? So I said that literature has been calling for this more nuanced view. So what can this show us in comparison to the others? Specifically, I wanted to know how Chicago Cubans perceive members of recent waves of immigration, and is it similar to the literature that exists in Miami that shows a high stigma for these recent arrivals? And does the Chicago community have an exile ideology such as has been documented for so many years in Miami? And so then after that, my second question was then how is this Chicago Cuban American identity evidenced in their Spanish and in their attitudes towards different varieties of Spanish? How does this compare to the other documented communities and their attitudes? All right, so quickly before I get into how I collected all this data, just a quick overview of my positionality and where that places me in terms of limitations. So I am the daughter of a first-generation Cuban immigrant. Obviously, that means he is a native Spanish speaker. He arrived prior to 1975. He is very politically conservative. And that is quite opposite to my mother, who is Mexican. And she is about 2.5 gen because she's got a bit of a mix, right? Her father was G1, her mother was G2. And she has little to no Spanish proficiency, and she is a diehard Democrat. We're talking about politics because we're eventually going to get into politics, obviously, with my informants, my participants, okay? And that is further complicated and nuanced by my G1 Dominican husband, who is also a native Spanish speaker and is politically left-leaning. So all of this forms potential limitations, as my political leanings are absolutely left-leaning. And I am not a native speaker of Spanish. I am a heritage speaker of Spanish, but I'm informed by specifically my father's Spanish and not my mother's, because she didn't have Spanish proficiency. So I'm very much informed by this G1 Cuban Spanish, arrived prior to 1975. And my entire life was kind of primed with the ideologies that come along with that. So I very much grew up hearing my father say these types of things that I was seeing come out in the research, right? And so that presents a lot of potential limitations, right? I had to repeatedly check for the biases that these could present, right? In my already speaking a Cubanized type Spanish and having grown up hearing these messages. And additionally, it created a potential complication with my participants potentially seeing me as what's referred to in the research as an illusion of sameness, right? So this assumption that we are both Cuban, you get it, I don't have to explain it. And so it resulted in a need to really kind of pull details out even further with my participants and make sure that they weren't making any assumptions. And I wasn't making any assumptions when they referred to anything about Cuban Spanish and Cuban identity. The flip side of that coin is I could also be perceived as very othered and outside of the group because I am not fully 100% Cuban, right? So those that knew me, that I collected data from, knew that I am only half Cuban. So I had to kind of balance this positionality of like kind of perceived as in-group, kind of perceived as out-group, and what is that going to give me when they decide to do my interviews? Yeah. So this happened between July 2021 to January 2022. The recruitment was done through snowball method, through people that were, family and friends that I personally knew growing up and my father personally knew growing up, and then spread to include recruitment in Cuban Facebook groups, which there are about 3 really large Cubans in the US Facebook groups. I posted my calls there and got a lot of participants from there as well. Overall, here's what my recruitment looked like. I had 31 individuals complete my dialectal ranking task, and then 20 of those went on to do a follow-up sociolinguistic interview. So in the first session, they completely verified their eligibility. They filled out some information with biographical information, some information about their social network, and then they completed the MINT in Spanish and English. Those of you who might not be familiar with this is a naming task, right? So they're presented with the images and they need to name it first, obviously in Spanish, and they go all the way through those images. And they go from incredibly frequent words to incredibly infrequent words. And this gives us an idea of their proficiency in either language. And then if you compare the results of both, you get an image about their language dominance as well. And then finally, they completed this dialect evaluation task where they were presented with different varieties of Spanish and asked to rate them. Then after that, some were invited for a follow-up session, which was about 45 to 60 minutes, and it was semi-structured sociolinguistic interview. So all of this was analyzed individually. So I collected all of my dialectal perception task data before, and then I ran my statistics. So I did overall averages, I did linear regressions in R, and then the emerging themes that seem to be coming out from the results of this were used to reshape and form the questions of my interview that would be related specifically to linguistic ideology to kind of confirm whether these themes were correct in the eyes of my participants or not. And then the sociolinguistic interviews all went through 2 different rounds of coding. First round was in vivo, second round was thematic to kind of group these overwhelming emerging themes that I saw coming out. So just a quick look of what that first task looked like, this dialectal evaluation task. They were given these directions: consider the following varieties. These are the varieties that I decided to include. Notably, there are much less varieties than Alfaraz's original task. And this is because the demographic breakdown of Chicago is quite different than the demographic breakdown of Miami. So we are not as dialectally diverse, and I decided to only include Cuban varieties, and then also what are the dominant varieties in Chicago, and that is Mexican and Puerto Rican Spanish. And then I included Spain because that did hold the top spot in Alfaraz's study, and I wanted to see if that bore out in this study as well. The other change that happened with this data collection was the naming of these 2 Cuban varieties. So Alfaraz in her study said diaspora compared to island variety. I conducted a pilot study and I found that that terminology was incredibly politically priming. And that people immediately started talking about politics before they started talking about language, right? So there was assumption that diaspora meant rejection of Castro versus island meant accepting Castro, right? And so I decided to shift this because I didn't want them to be primed for politics yet. And so I decided to go with a year distinction. And so the year that I went to was that shift that happened between the second and third wave. Finally, the final difference between Alfaraz's study and mine, hers rated for correctness, 1 to 7. I decided to use categories that more implicitly get to determinations of prestige and stigma, and these were intelligence, professionalism, friendliness, and attractiveness. Those were the categories that were rated. So let's get into the results. Looking at professionalism, I've got Miami ratings from Alfaraz's original study in blue and Chicago ratings in red. So when we can compare, we've got correctness for Miami, and what goes along with perception of correctness? Well, professionalism and education. So here I've got a direct comparison of correctness to professionalism. Here we see that both Miami and Chicago assign prestige to Spain and Cuba. However, the order is inverted, right? So in Miami, we see that Spain had the top spot, followed by Cuba. Chicago, that was a bit inverted. So Cuba actually takes the top spot. Cuba 1, meaning prior to 1975, takes the top spot. And Spain follows right after. Both Chicago and Miami assigned significantly lower ratings to than the remaining varieties, which is Mexican, Puerto Rican, and post-1975 Cuban Spanish. So the overall general trend is very similar. However, it's important to note that the ratings that came from Chicago participants were not as low for these three varieties as they were in Miami. So while they were definitely significantly lower than Spain and Cuba post-1975, they were not as low as those that were provided by the Miami participants. Comparing intelligence, we see the exact same trend. So both communities, Chicago and Miami, assigned prestige to Spain and Cuba 1. And Mexican and Puerto Rican and Cuba post-1975 fall significantly lower than those two, being considered significantly less intelligent than those first two top spots. And once again, Chicago ratings were not as low as Miami ratings. Now, what about friendliness? Now, here I don't have a comparison for Miami because Miami only looked for correctness, right? And friendliness is typically the opposite side of that coin when we look at linguistic perception. What is considered correct is not always considered friendly, vice versa, right? So I wanted to know, well, what do they think about how friendly it is? And so here we see things shift. So as you recall, Spain was rated pretty highly in terms of education and professionalism. Here we see a notable dip when we're looking at friendliness. Specifically, the Spaniard variety of Spanish was perceived to be the least friendly out of all varieties that were analyzed in this study, and this was a statistically significant finding. So although Mexico, Cuba, post-1975, and Puerto Rico are considered significantly less professional educational, they are still considered more friendly than the very prestigious Spaniard variety. And then there's no surprise here that Cuba pre-1975 receives the most friendly rating, as most Cubans here are members of that prior to 1975 wave. So of course they're going to select themselves and their friends and family as the most friendly. So we looked at this in terms of generational breakdown to see if there was anything different happening between my first and second generation participants. And indeed there was in terms of the indication of Spaniard friendliness. So my mixed linear regressions showed that second generation participants rated Spaniard Spanish even less friendly than the first generation. So this ideology is intensifying generationally, which is pretty interesting. And then finally, attractiveness. So once again, the prestige for Spaniard and Cuba pre-1975 comes back, which is pretty interesting. We don't always see this correlation. Sometimes what is perceived as correct is not always what's perceived as attractive, but here that is what bore out. So Cuba 1, meaning prior to 1975, and Spain were assigned with the highest ratings in terms of attractiveness, with significantly lower ratings for Mexican, Puerto Rican, and post-1975 Cuba. So we are seeing a common trend here. So what's going on in terms of similarity to Miami is that, yes, they definitely assigned prestige to Spain and Cuba prior 1975. However, Chicago ratings for Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuba post 1975 are higher than those that were assigned in Miami. So we've got a bit of a shift in terms of ideology. While there is a difference between these two groupings, it's not as drastic. And we're not exactly sure what this means, but one possibility is that there's simply increased exposure in the Chicago metropolitan neighborhood to Mexican and Puerto Rican Spanish. As we looked at before, these are actually the dominant groups and varieties in Chicago. So it might be just a result of increased exposure that results to a bit of a more positive rating for these varieties. My generational analysis of sociolinguistic factors showed that generation does not affect the assigning of prestige varieties. So the assigning of educational and proficiency did not correlate generationally. This is different from Miami, whereas Alvarez found that actually second generation participants rated Cuba post 1975 as even less correct than their first generation counterparts. So the stigma of post 1975 Cuban Spanish intensifies generationally in Miami. Here in Chicago, we did not find that. Finally, my friendly ratings suggested a larger amount of solidarity with Cuba post 1975 and Puerto Rico. And furthermore, a bit of a stigma for Spain in terms of being considered as least friendly, and we saw this intensify generationally. Okay, so this is some additional interesting data that we don't have a comparison for Miami, but it gives us a better nuanced image of what's going on in Cuba, Chicago Cubans. So perhaps they don't identify post-1975 Cuban as professional or education, a high level of education, but they do have high levels of friendliness associated with these varieties. So this means that overall Chicago Cubans are showing a large amount of divergence from the Miami attitude findings that we have. This means that overwhelmingly Spanish ideology can shift outside of the Miami setting. We see different things in Chicago. All right, so now we can get to what was found in the sociolinguistic interviews. Once again, we're going back to this documented Cuban exile ideology. While researchers admit that this is an outdated monolithic image, this image is very real for my participants, right? So as I followed up on these themes, they very much agreed that this is the image of Miami Cubans for them. This is the perception that they have of Miami Cubans, which tells us a lot for why they still are in Chicago, right? So first, I followed up on terms of political partisanship and if they identified with this Republican loyalty that is assumed for the exile ideology in Miami. And we found that it was about 50-50. About half of my participants expressed that they were left-leaning and half of my participants expressed that they were right-leaning. They don't identify with this overwhelming Republican partisanship. In terms of their support for the U.S.-Cuba embargo, once again, pretty mixed, pretty split, 50-50. We don't see overwhelming support. Some were in favor, some were not. The third tenet was importance of a politician's stance on Cuba when voting. This was not important for them at all. They said it's probably one of the last things on their mind when they pick their candidate. They don't expect political candidates in this day and age to express outward support or rejection for Cuba. And I added an additional theme that was relevant in the time that I collected data, which was July 2021, which is when this SOS Cuba, San Isidro movement was really becoming popular and evident on social media, which were these protests that occurred during that time, that summer of 2021 in Cuba. And so I asked what they felt about that and potential U.S. intervention. And they said absolutely not. They did not expect the U.S. to intervene, that they were aware of the protests, but they did not expect U.S. intervention, whereas their perception was very much Miami Cubans did, that Miami Cubans were asking for the U.S. to get involved. So the second part of the interview asked them to elaborate on the linguistic perceptions that were expressed in that rating task. So we followed up on all of those first emerging themes, the first of which being this prestige for Spaniard Spanish and being perceived as more professional, more highly educated. And they said, well, basically, this is the mother tongue for us. This is where Spanish comes from. So of course, we are going to consider this to be the most professional, the most educational, because that's what Spanish, quote, should sound like. When we followed up on why the ratings of friendliness were so low, they said that for them, it has a very exclusionary feel. So while it is perceived as very formal and very educated, the use of vosotros, the use of this theta variant makes it exclusionary because they feel like, well, maybe not everybody can understand it. And it's very different than all these other varieties present in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. And so this assigned prestige was definitely in alignment with what was expressed in Miami, but we don't have any kind of solidarity to Miami, the evidence from Miami, so we don't know if this exclusionary aspect would also bear out there as well. Then the interview questions shifted to this distinction between pre-1975 Cuba and post-1975 Cuba. So remember, they assigned prestige to pre-1975 Cuba, did not assign it to Cuba too. There was a notable stigma there. So I followed up and asked them to try and justify this, elaborate why they assigned these ratings. And so when they spoke to the prestigiousness of these varieties, most of my participants said that they felt that this variety of Spanish most closely resembles the Spaniard variety. Now, those of you that know anything about Caribbean Spanish, this is pretty funny because it does not, right? There's a lot going on in all varieties of Caribbean Spanish that does not replicate what's happening in specifically peninsular Spanish. We do see similarities when we look at southern regions of Spain, right? But this is not what they were expressing. They were talking about cities like Madrid and things like that, and saying that they felt it most closely resembled Spaniard variety Spanish, and that's why they perceive it to be more correct. So once again, this is in accordance with what we saw in Miami: high prestige, high level of correctness. They said that they perceive it to be more respectful and more formal to be used in these formal settings. When I asked them about the stigma of this post 1975 Cuba variety, they said that yes, they do. They are aware of their negative perception of this variety, that they have a perception of an increased amount of slang and vulgarity among the Spanish used on the island today and in the Spanish of recent arrivals. However, there were some positive notions expressed in interviews that surprised me. Specifically, several of my participants noted the fact that recent arrivals to the United States have a complete education in Spanish, meaning they were able to go all the way through high school, maybe even further, in a Spanish monolingual setting, whereas most who immigrated in that first generation to the United States had their education in Spanish interrupted. And so they said that they felt like those who come over recently show a more complete education, their vocabulary impresses them, and they feel like that's where their Spanish might be lacking. When I followed this up with my second generation participants, they were entirely unaware of a distinction between first and this pre-1975 and post-1975 immigration. They said they hadn't heard of it. They were not aware of it. Although we saw that that wasn't exactly true in the rating task, right? But when we followed up in these sociolinguistic interviews, they said they had never heard of it. They were not aware of it. Okay. So once again, we've got similarity in the negative perception, similarity in Miami, but we also see some differences here with this positive notion and a difference in the generational perception. When we asked them about the negative ratings for Spanish, they said that once again, they feel like there's a high level of slang going on with this variety, and they also complained about what they perceive to be a sing-songy intonation that is different from Cuban Spanish. And then finally, when we asked them about Puerto Rico, they said that they cited high levels of friendliness because they perceive it to be the most similar to Cuban Spanish. And it just sounds familiar to them because of that similarity. Okay, so what's going on in terms of identity, right? With that, we looked into everything about Spanish ideology, and then I wanted to get some data about what are the things that index Cuban American identity here in Miami. So they overwhelmingly talked about the fact that the population is very dispersed across the city and into the suburbs. One of my participants said, sometimes you feel like they're all in Florida and there's just 10 of us here. All of these businesses, these Cuban businesses that boomed in the 60s and 80s, most of which have since closed. There has been a recent boom in the last 5 to 10 years, though none of my participants had any kind of a consensus of where's the spot to go. Like there's no truly Cuban restaurant or store anymore. For a while, the Cuban Festival in Reese Park was the only social event that remained for Cubans, whereas there used to be a lot more in the 60s and 70s. It's since defunct. It stopped pretty much when the COVID pandemic surged. Even when it existed, there was a pretty negative perception among my participants, and they said that they didn't feel like this festival was actually specific to Cubanidad, that it really just pulled all Latinos from all of Chicago, and it wasn't a true representation of Cubanidad. So when I asked them what is Cubanidad to them and how do they maintain it at home and intergenerationally, overwhelmingly they cited things like food, music, family values, and these additional symbols such as the azabache, which is this black coral that is thought to ward off negative energy, and this agua de violetas, which is a perfume that is very commonly put on babies and children in Cuban families. These are the things that they cited when I asked, how do they keep this Cuban culture alive? One of the trends that I did notice in my interview results that was also documented in Alfaraz was what she referred to as ombliguismo, right? So ombliguismo, we're talking about el ombligo, the belly button. So the idea is like looking down to your belly button instead of looking out at the world around you, essentially focusing on yourself, essentializing yourself over others. So Alfaraz found that these initial wave immigrants prior to 1975 essentialized their identity and their experience, invalidating those that are different to their experience, leading to an erasure. And I did find this in my participants. So specifically in terms of relating to upward mobility and in the whiteness, the perceived whiteness of Cubans. So when discussing this perceived upward mobility, socioeconomic mobility of Cubans, they said things like, well, we just work harder. Maybe other immigrants can get a factory job and they're thrilled with that because at least they're working. Whereas our parents were like, well, yeah, I'm getting a factory job, but I want to do something better in the next 10 years. So we see them kind of essentializing themselves, centralizing themselves, saying like, we are the exception because we just have higher motivation than other immigrants. Additionally, we saw this in terms of this assumption of Cuban whiteness. So when I followed up this question about why are Cubans so upwardly mobile, many said that Cubans can be quickly perceived as white because of their phenotypical presentation, and that this allows them, this upward mobility allows them this success, which is entirely erasing the existence of Afro-Cubans. Finally, there was a high level of identity insecurity that was expressed among my participants. So they didn't feel truly Cuban. They used terms like Cuban infused, or they said, I only feel Cuban in Chicago. If I go to Miami, I don't feel Cuban anymore. I'm not as Cuban as them. And we saw that first generation was very concentrated on US assimilation, and that might be what led to this then insecurity, that they were so focused on assimilating to the US culture. And we see second generations kind of looking to reestablish their cultural identity after their parents wanted to assimilate. So we see that they make an effort for continued use of Spanish, and in addition, they are open to travel to the island, whereas first generation my immigrants were not in this study. All right, the last thing we're going to look at is what did they cite when I asked them, what does Cuban Spanish sound like? So I thought this would be some interesting data to pull, and I said, okay, when you think of Cuban Spanish, what does it sound like to you? And they gave me some interesting examples, right? So I analyzed those examples in Pratt, and this is what I found was overwhelmingly presented. So we had some phonological stuff going on, like deletion of syllable final S, deletion of intervocalic D, so things like está instead of estás, enamorado instead of enamorado. And lateralization of syllable final R. So, for example, conducir as opposed to conducir. I saw some super segmental things and comments. So they referred to a dramatic rise and fall in intonation and the fact that we are perceived to be louder than other varieties. I also saw some lexical variations. So they pointed to some words that to them are very important to maintain Cuban Spanish. So the importance of saying espejuelos compared to lentes, the importance of saying things like mata instead of árbol. Something that came out in the Mint task was cachumbambe instead of sub y baja. So some lexical items that they hold very important to them. Finally, we saw some syntactical things such as the increased use of tú, and the subject-verb order, and the fact that there's no inversion happening in interrogatives, and we see this thing like que tú quieres, right? All of these things came out in the examples of when I asked them for, well, so what does Cuban Spanish sound like? Despite the importance of all features, all of these participants overwhelmingly lamented the fact that there is intergenerational language loss. So those who were second generation and had third generation children said that their children did not speak Spanish no matter how hard they had tried, that they were not proficient in Spanish. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to give you a little quick breakdown of what they expressed when I asked them if they have a distinction between these two waves. So like I said, this came out in the rating task, and I asked them to then elaborate. And when I asked them about their perceptions, they said that yes, pre-1975, they have very positive perceptions. They perceive them to be hardworking, family-oriented, professional, highly educated, and very focused on financial success. Whereas those who arrived after 1975 had a very negative perception. They referred to their acclamation to a communist socialist system. They said that they're less professional, and they insinuated that they're complacent with any job that they receive. So we saw these negative perceptions that came out in the ranking task even further validated in the data that came out of the sociolinguistic interviews. So very much so, this stigma and this distinction that's present in Miami is present here in Chicago as well. All right, so overwhelmingly, I'm going to skip to my overall conclusions here. We do see Chicago Cubans showing divergence from Miami in terms of their linguistic attitudes. We saw some different things going on with perceptions of Mexican and Puerto Rican Spanish, but we did see a replication of the stigma between pre-1975 and post-1975 Cuban Spanish. We see a difference in the way that the Cuban identity is indexed, right? So there's a shift away from language and more towards these other markers like music and food and family values. There's a legitimization of the Miami community. So they overwhelmingly say that that is what it means to be Cuban. And then anybody outside of that area is considered less Cuban and, quote, Cuban infused. And finally, this validates the need for continued research. So personally, my next two steps with this work, I would like to conduct my own match guys like Alfaraz did as well, which is mismatching those audio and labels and seeing if we get more information about these linguistic ideology beliefs that Chicago Cubans tend to hold. And I would like to conduct follow-up interviews and focus groups to confirm or potentially have to adjust these emerging themes that I found with these first two rounds of data collection to be able to further add to this nuanced image of Miami and Chicago. All right, some quick acknowledgements. My amazing committee. My Chicago Cuban participants that gave me so much of their time, and of course the UIC School of Literatures, Cultural Studies, and Linguistics for their funding and for their support of my work. Thank you guys so much. Preguntas.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Súper interesante. Adelante si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, por favor.
Pueden hablar o pueden poner las preguntas en el chat también, está bien.
Gracias, Damián. No tengan miedo. Cualquier pregunta.
Pues también.
I have a little question. Let's see, not to distract, but you said that there was work on Cubans in Albuquerque. I'm totally unaware of that. And not to distract from your excellent talk, but could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's one study that was done, I believe in the early 2000s, and she did some work on these two southwestern neighborhoods. So it was one combined study that had two groups, one from Albuquerque and one from, I think it was Austin, was the other group, Austin, Texas. And most of her work was not related to linguistics. It was actually related to racial and ethnic identity and how they position themselves in juxtaposition with other groups. So that gave me a lot of rich data of like how they feel about Cubanidad and if they replicate this like Cuban exceptionalism, if they're aware of this stigma and this distinction between this pre-1975 and post-1975. They don't have any linguistic data because the focus was very much identity and race. But I decided to include it in my dissertation because it was really the only thing out there outside of Miami was this one singular study that I will absolutely send to you right after this. And then there was this great book written about Union City, New Jersey. Those were the only pieces of information and research that I could find outside of Miami to have some kind of comparison of what could this potentially look like in a different location.
Cool, thank you. And thank you for giving a talk to our linguistics community here. And, just anecdotally, it seemed like, for a while here in Albuquerque, the Cuban community had a large presence with, certain bands like Son Como Son, certain nightclubs that no longer exist. Just a comment, what great work, as you know, I love perceptual work, and it's great to see this coming out.
Thank you so much.
¿Otras preguntas? I have one. Could you remind me what were the adjectives that you used for your rating task
Mhm.
again?
Yeah,
They
so
were
I had 2 adjectives that were aligned with what would get some implicit information about prestige, and I had 2 that would kind of be linked more to potential solidarity. So my 4 adjectives were intelligent, professional, friendly, and attractive. And this shift in characteristics, identified characteristics, came from a piece that I'm trying to remember exactly. I think it was Philip Carter was the first to do this switch in his attitudinal data that he was collecting in Miami, and I decided to shift my replication of alpha to include these, just to see if it gave us any more of a nuanced image, and it did. Right, we saw a difference between what is perceived as intelligent and what is perceived as friendly.
Great, thank you.
Yo también tengo una pregunta relacionada a esa misma cosa que tienes en la pantalla ahora, de ese mismo tema. ¿Y por qué elegiste un 7-point scale? ¿Por qué 7 y no 5 o 10? Solo me pregunto si hay una razón.
Ya, sobre todo, la mayoría de la investigación suele usar el 7-point scale. Parece que se presta mejor a este análisis estadística. There's less of like a ceiling effect going on. And really, I kept the point scale the same porque estaba haciendo una replicación modificada de Alfarás y la escala de ella fue 1 a 7. Entonces, para poder hacer comparaciones directas, tenía que mantener la misma escala. Pero con lo que yo he visto por lo largo de estudios así que quieren revelar ideologías lingüísticas, se suele usar la escala de 1 a 7. Tengo entendido que tiene que ver con algo de la interpretación estadística. I am not a statistician. I learned the stat that I needed to do for this, pero sí confío en los expertos cuando me dicen que el 7-point scale es lo que vale y lo que se suele usar más. And then it helps with comparability since that's what's out there.
Muchas gracias. Tengo otra preguntita, si alguien, a menos que alguien más quiera preguntar, pero mi pregunta es, ¿te sorprendiste de los resultados que tuviste sobre las tendencias políticas? Que era como que 50-50, ¿verdad? ¿Eso dijiste? ¿O tú pensabas que iba a ser más hacia un lado o hacia el otro?
Bueno, como yo me crié dentro de la comunidad, había escuchado a lo largo de mi vida, de mi niñez y eso, que no había ese pensamiento tan monolítico en cuanto a la política aquí en Chicago. Y siempre hacían esa comparación. Pero no, bueno, no somos como los de Miami. Sabemos que los de Miami piensan así, piensan así. Pero nosotros acá estamos más abiertos a diferencias, ¿no? And additionally, when I was pulling in all of my research and reading about, okay, what do we know about Cubans? There's a really great book that was developed by Maria de Los Angeles Torres, who's also at UIC. And she documented Cubans all across the United States. And she's been like shouting into the abyss for ages that Cubans are not just Republican, that it's always been pretty much a 50-50 split. La razón por qué se suelen representar como más conservadores, pues porque suelen ser las voces más altas de la comunidad. Y porque dentro de Miami, el Partido Republicano ha ofrecido más apoyo y representación política a los cubanos que el Partido Demócrata. So they kind of just made a move to represent Cubans politically in the 70s and 80s. And so Miami Cubans kind of saw that as the party of like, okay, this is the party that's going to help us. Democrats haven't tried to support political careers for us, whereas Republicans have. And so typically the people that you see in politics are Republicans because historically that party has provided more support to Cubans. There is an assumption that it comes from this original Castro into power, pushing away from leftist ideologies, pushing away from communism. That has something to do with it, but it really has more to do with kind of who offered them resources and who offered them political representation once they were established here. Pero sí, aquí in Chicago, I was used to hearing people like say like, well, here we have some Democrats, but you can't say that in Miami. Like, don't say something like this in Miami, or everyone's going to jump down your throat. So I was happy to kind of get that information and put it into writing of like, there's something different going on than what's documented so far.
Muy interesante, muchas gracias por compartir eso.
Encantada.
We have a comment in the chat from Gabriela, who said, I grew up with the West Side Story movie, and with this study, it made me really reevaluate my understanding of the prejudice that existed in the casting and representation of Cubans being more white passing in the movie as well. Thank you for your information, and I truly hope you are able to further the understandings of the effects of Fidel Castro had on Cuba and the Americas.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the poor representation of Latinos in general in the media. And Cubans have not been free of that, right? So there's been a lot of misrepresentation of what it means to look and sound Cuban in the media as well.
Muchísimas gracias. No sé si alguien tenga otra pregunta más antes de despedirnos. Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Betancourt por acompañarnos y ser la primera valiente de participar en nuestras series de Spanish Series en UNM. Le vamos a compartir esta liga con todos para que puedan compartirla con sus estudiantes, o si quieren volver a verla, o para compartir con colegas que no tuvieron la oportunidad de asistir. Muchas gracias, Ángela. ¿Algo más que quieras decir para despedirte?
Muchísimas gracias por recibirnos. And if you see a petition circulating around there about supporting UIC's School of Literature's Cultural Studies and Linguistics, go ahead and sign it for us, please. We're kind of fighting for our lives here to keep our studies alive at UIC.
Ay, pues si gustas mandárnosla para que nosotros la podamos compartir, la esperamos por correo electrónico.
Claro.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a todos por participar. Son las 12:58, así que vamos a respetar el tiempo de todos y los esperamos en las próximas semanas. Vamos a compartir los 3 invitados más que vamos a tener antes de que termine el semestre. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a todos.